How many times have you heard administrators say this? You need to foster good relationships with your students in order to have better classroom management.
Duh.
Of course that makes sense, but rarely do they tell you how to do that. So how do you do that? Well, that is what this video is about. But before I share those 3 things you got to do, I want to share this quote with you. And this wraps up the whole entire idea of culture in classroom. It goes like this. Culture is not created by what we celebrate. Culture is created by what we tolerate. One more time. Culture is not created by what we celebrate. Culture is created by what we tolerate. So let's get to that first thing you got to do. Know your expectations. This is it's so easy for me to say that now because I've been doing this 20 years and I have 20 years of experience. Of course, I know exactly what I'm looking at a classroom. But if you're a new teacher, 1, 2, 3, this is a hard thing for you to figure out. It sounds like, oh, no problem. I want students to behave. I want students to be good. But what exactly does that mean? What is your expectations of students? And I really want you to think about this. I want you to think about every little aspect of your classroom. How do you want students to behave during each time in your class, during each minute in your classroom, during each activity, during each transition, during conversations, during group work? How do you want them to act? Because if you don't have it clear in your mind, it's not going to happen. I offer this course on classroom management. And in fact, if you want this course on classroom management, I'll put a link down below. It's yours free, 100%. Definitely, hopefully, I'm sure you'll get something from it. But in that course, I have a worksheet that goes along with it. It's one of the first things we do is to figure out exactly what you want from your students. From the moment they walk in to the moment they leave, what are your expectations? Because if you have that firmly in your mind, then you can move your class in that direction. So that is the first thing you got to do. The second thing you got to do is once you know what you expect, once you know what you want, you got to create and communicate those boundaries. How do you do that? It's done through repetition. It is done through repetition. It is done through being consistent. Once you know what you want from the very beginning, you want to communicate that, demonstrate that, practice that with your students. Most people don't believe me when I say this, but I spend the first 2 to 3 weeks of my class, just going over those rules and procedures. We are just practicing. We are creating that culture in the classroom. During those 2 or 3 weeks, students get to know me, I get to know them, but more importantly, we get to know what the expectations are in the classroom and what the student's role is in the classroom. And we practice it, I share it, I communicate it, we practice, and it just goes over and over and over again. Those 2 to 3 weeks, I am telling you, they pay dividends in the end. You put the work in the beginning, and you're going to see huge results all throughout the year. But once you know exactly what you want, then you have to communicate that with your students, and then of course you have to practice that with your students. And the last thing you got to do is this: you got to enforce those boundaries. Once you know what the students' expectations are in your class, once you know what students should and shouldn't be doing, once students know what they should and shouldn't be doing, they're going to push it. They're going to test those boundaries. I like to say just students, but I think that's human nature. I think it's human nature. We're always testing the boundaries of whatever else it may be. Sometimes positive, sometimes negative, right? But we're always testing boundaries. Students are no different. You're going to have some students that even though you express to them what the expectations are, even though you set the boundaries, you practice rule procedures, they're still going to push that envelope. Maybe because they're just trying to get some feedback from you or some reaction from you. Maybe it's because they're going with something personally, they don't know how to deal with it. Whatever the reason is, they're going to test the boundaries. And it's so important to enforce those boundaries. One, with that student, right? But the other is by how you interact with a student, it displays, it's an example of how you act towards other students. And if you let things slide, other students are going to pick up on that, and next thing you know, more and more boundaries are going to be pushed. So here we go. Make sure you know exactly what you want, communicate that to the students, and then the last part is carry through in those boundaries.